Hey students, this is Mr. Moore and I am back for another AP European History review session to help students to score well and be ready and feel confident for the AP test that they'll be taking. Unit 1 covers the Renaissance and exploration from 1450 to 1648, and this is topic 1.10. It's about a commercial revolution. Some of these concepts might even fall outside of the aspects of these dates. A lot of the things in this first unit are things that begin during the later Renaissance and perpetuate way into the rest of the class. And so I think that should be pointed out. This commercial revolution is something that's going to start as Europeans start exploring and interacting and trading with places around the world. But the ramifications of it are going to reach well beyond this time period of 1450 to 1648. This learning objective M says, explain European commercial and agricultural developments and their economic effects from 1450 to 1648. And one of the things that I'd like to point out is that there's this agricultural revolution. And here in this slide it says 1700s, but again, this agricultural revolution is going to be starting during the 1600s, well within the scope of that 1450 to 1648, but it's going to reach way beyond. I actually included the agricultural revolution as a part of my scientific revolution discussion because Europeans start to use scientific principles to enhance their understanding of how crops grow, how to improve yield, and those kind of things. So again, when I cover stuff in class, it doesn't always line up with the exact way or the exact order that the European history study guides, these key concept study guides go in. But nonetheless, we did cover these concepts in class, and I pulled out some of the old notes that we did in class, and they're available on my website, so you can jump over and review your own notes and make sure you have an understanding of these things. Innovations in banking and finance promoted the growth of urban financial centers and a money economy. It's amazing how powerful money can be as it helps to facilitate trade. If you're living in a barter economy where people just trade goods of similar values, it's really hard to grow an international market. One of the countries that dominated during this time period, if you look from 1450 to 1648, is definitely the Spanish. The Portuguese and the Spanish were in competition. And the Spanish really revolutionized the money system. I've talked about this in some of the previous review sessions, but the pieces of eight, the pesos de ocho, or the Spanish milled dollar, really becomes an international currency that allows for international trade and then a money economy, which means that if people respect money and they understand the value of it, then they're much easier and more willing to trade. That's why there are, currencies in the world today that are used that hold a strong value, like the American dollar, is used across the globe. You can go to almost any country in the world and people will recognize and be willing to give you things for the American dollar. There are even some countries that have gotten permission to officially use the US dollar in today's society, like Ecuador. If you go to Ecuador, they literally use the US dollar as their currency. Their government has permission to regulate that. And El Salvador, the economies of El Salvador, right here in Central America, and like when I was traveling in El Salvador, and this is even like, man, 20 years ago, their currency was in such flux and such a small country and struggling economy that they got permission from the US government to use the US dollar to stabilize their economy, and they still use that. So there are several countries around the world. The other currency that are really strong on the planet Earth today, of course, is the euro. Most countries in Europe are a part of something called the European Union, which is something we'll discuss in a further, or it's quite a few units off Right now we're in the 1450s to 1648. But in the modern world, most countries in Western Europe use the euro. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. And it allows for more stable economies and for international trade. Great Britain has always had one of the strongest currencies in the world. It's called the British pound. And so the US dollar, the British pound, and the euro from the European Union are amongst the most valuable and widely traded currencies in the world and used for international trade. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about a money economy. It goes back to the 1450s and to 1648 as Europeans are exploring and taking over places. It's going to help shape the world that we live in today. Next bullet point right here. Most Europeans derived their livelihood from agriculture and oriented their lives around the seasons, the village, or the manor, although economic changes began to alter rural production and power. The word rural is like countryside, where there's not many people living, spread out, okay, as opposed to urban life, that's city life. And almost all Europeans were involved in, growing crops. That's what agriculture means. People lived on the farm. They grew what they needed to for subsistence, to survive. And then if they had excess, they would trade that at local markets. But that's all going to change. We're going to see the development of these farms that are developed to make money, as opposed to farms that are used for people to have subsistence is the word. And so that's going to be the general evolution of agriculture. And it's going to, the scientific revolution that we talk about later on is going to help enhance that. And that, again, is why I talked about the agricultural revolution in my scientific revolution presentation in class. And again, you can find all my notes on my website. Subsistence agriculture was the rule in most areas, with 3 crop field rotation in the north and 2 crop rotation in the Mediterranean. In many cases, farmers paid rent and labor service for their lands. Crop rotation is important because over time people start to realize that if you grow the same crop on the same piece of land year after year, you're going to deplete the soil. There are some crops that add certain nutrients in to the ground and certain ones that take it out. And if you keep growing the same crop on the same piece of land year after year, you're going to get a less yield. And so it depends on where you are, but they started to develop this technique of rotating crops around. The price revolution contributed to the accumulation of capital. That capital is extra money. What you have more than what you need to survive. That's capital. If you put something in and you get out more than you put in, that becomes your capital. And that's going to lead to an economic system called capitalism. Okay? So the accumulation of capital and the expanse of the market economy through the commercialization of agriculture, which benefited large landowners in Western Europe. The people who struggle because of this are going to be those small farms, those people who didn't own land. The people who are going to benefit are those landowners that had giant farms. And the rich are going to get richer and the poor are going to get poorer, and that's going to eventually lead to some social catastrophic problems later on. Population recovered to its pre-plague levels in the 16th century. So during the 1500s, the population of Europe starts to grow. Please remember that during the 1300s, right before this class started, because again, this class starts in 1450, but during the 1300s, there is a huge amount of people, millions of people, that die of the plague. They say that maybe up to half of the population of Europe dies during the Black Death. And so the population starts to recover. And continued population pressure contributed to uneven price increases. The population starts to grow. It starts to put a strain on food production and food security. People knowing that they have food. Agricultural commodities increase more sharply than wages, reducing standards of living, living standards for some. Uh, Sometimes in our modern world, we get to this point where we see, like when we walk into Costco and we just see, food stacked up to the ceilings. We forget sometimes um, that food shortages and population pressures and things like a pandemic or a plague can have a huge impact on the food that's available to people. And so people's sometimes standard of living and the economy can be affected by that. And after you have a pandemic like the Great Plague, there's going to be economic consequences for years after. And that's a concept that some people in the modern world are starting to understand because of modern health issues. This is the second learning objective for this same topic. It's learning objective N, explain European commercial and agricultural developments and their social effects from 1450 to 1648. Economic change produced new social patterns, while traditions of hierarchy and status continued. So what we start to see is there are merchants who have a little bit more say in society, and depending on where you lived, especially in the Dutch republics, if you go to the Dutch areas, they allowed for a little bit more social advancement. They were what we're going to call later a little bit more liberal, and not holding on to all of the old ways of doing things. But in England, there is a new breed of people who are merchant class and start to make money from this new idea of capitalism, but they're still holding on to their nobility and their titled hierarchy, and that's what it's telling us right here. The growth of commercial products produced a new economic elite, which related to traditional landholding elites in different ways in Europe's various geographic regions. So that really means that if you're in Spain, it was working out differently than it was in Italy, which wasn't really a country back then, versus how it worked in the Holy Roman Empire, Germany today. So it's kind of very much a geography thing. As you're looking at Europe, how this whole new agricultural revolution. And let's be honest, and this is something that's been discussed in our class quite a bit, that the agricultural revolution really takes shape in England, okay, in what we call today the United Kingdom, and in the Dutch areas, using windmills and dikes and watering systems and crop rotation systems. In the United Kingdom, they're going to be incorporating things like selective breeding, but it's definitely going to shape. Okay, so if I was to focus in on an agricultural development, as was pointed out, definitely the British Isles and the Dutch areas. This bullet point right here says, as Western Europe moved toward a free peasantry and commercial agriculture, serfdom was codified in the East, where nobles continued to dominate economic life on large estates. What does that mean in plain English? It means that Eastern Europe is different from Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, okay, this whole idea of serfdom and the whole peasant class is going to stick around a heck of a lot longer than it is in Western Europe. I mean, if you're paying attention when I was discussing even things like the Russian Revolution that happened during World War I, Russia's just barely coming out of that whole serfdom at the end of the 1800s. Some might even say even deep into the 1900s, there was still this idea of serfdom going on in Russia. That's why Russia is so prime for revolution at the beginning of the 1900s, is because it lingered so long in Eastern Europe, whereas in Western Europe it's gonna fall apart, especially after the French Revolution. The attempts of landlords to increase their revenue by restricting or abolishing the traditional rights of peasants led to revolt. So the rich are getting richer, the poor are staying poor. Migrants to the cities challenged the ability of merchant elites and craft guilds to govern and strained resources. So we're seeing people leaving the countryside. It's a migration away from the countryside, the rural parts of Europe, into the cities. And cities are going to boom, and that's going to cause sanitation problems. Okay, and overcrowdedness in cities like London is going to be a cesspool until they figure out, how to get waste out of the city. And that's going to come. It's going to be several centuries until those things catch up to the population. From the late 16th century on, so from 1500s on, Europeans responded to economic and environment challenges, such as the Little Ice Age, by delaying marriage and childbearing. This European marriage pattern restrained population growth and ultimately improved the economic condition of families. Historians look at there was some climate change that was going on back in the like it says 16th century here, where crops were failing, and they were having that creates an economic ripple effect. And it also means that populations are going to kind of even out a little bit more. And quite frankly, a lot of Europeans are going to start, during especially the 17th century, start leaving Europe. And they're going to start settling in the Americas because of the population constraints. Some of the cities were getting so overcrowded, especially in, like, say, England, like London. They're going to start moving to colonies in the New World. And that's going to help alleviate some of those economic pressures. But it also means that if there's economic uncertainty, people delay when they get married, and they'll try to maybe curb how many kids they have. People tend to not want to bring kids into the world if they're not certain of the future. If you're looking at your life and you think that the future is going to be better than the past, you're more likely to have children, right, and have a big family. But if you're looking at the future or your own, situation in life, and you're like, wow, this is not going good, then you're more likely to, have a small family. Here are some of the illustrative examples of the period innovations in banking and finance. Double entry bookkeeping. Single entry bookkeeping methods record entries only once and does not balance the transaction by recording an opposite credit or debit. But double entering allows a business to manage the equation assets equals liabilities plus owner's equity, that's your net worth, as it balances the accounts. What does that mean in plain English? If you keep track of things doubly, then it allows you to be able to keep track of how much you're actually accumulating in wealth. If all you do is record what comes in and what goes out, then you're only seeing things maybe in real time, and it doesn't give you the ability to see things in the long term. It's not just recorded what's coming in and going out, but it's also that accumulation of wealth that you need to pay attention to. And so this double entry bookkeeping, in today's world, we scan things, and complicated computer databases keep track so that a store knows how much of one product they sell during a day, during a week, over a year, and that allows them to order the right amounts, keep the shelves stocked. It's a pretty powerful thing we have today with computers. This is like an old school version of that, keeping track of inventory, seeing how your business is growing, not just managing what's coming in and going out, that would be single entry bookkeeping, but by keeping track of it in a double system, it allows you to record growth over time. Anyways, we don't need to get into too much of the economics, but the Bank of Amsterdam, established in 1609, is generally seen as the first modern central bank and helped the city of Amsterdam become one of the most wealthy cities in Europe during the 1600s. This also led to the Dutch East India Company. This is one of the most powerful multinational joint stock corporations that monopolized and dominated the spice trade between Europe and Asia during the early 1600s. A joint stock company. One of the things that we're going to talk about here with a joint stock company is when you have a company that has value but you don't have enough money to help it grow, then you can sell off small pieces of your company to investors. And that's what stock markets are. And the Dutch are kind of famous for pretty much inventing the first stock market. And so these joint stock companies would divvy up the value of their company into smaller pieces and allow investors to come in and take advantage of that. The British East India Company is also a joint stock company that controlled trade between Europe and Asia during the late 1600s through the 1800s, controlling huge parts of India and later parts of China, having its own private army and navy to protect British interests abroad. It's this British East India Company that's going to be involved in opium wars during the 1800s. Again, out of the scope of this time period, but what we're seeing is the foundations of what's going to be built on in this class. The commercialization of agriculture, the enclosure movement, the legal process in England of consolidating or enclosing small landholdings into larger farms. Once enclosed, use of the land was restricted to the owner, and it ceased to be common land for communal use. So in old school England, like during, say, medieval times, in the village, there would be a central piece of the village where all the locals could grow their own vegetables, and they would have a little bit of access to control some of the crop production so they could feed their own family. But as Great Britain was going through this agricultural revolution that we discussed here a little bit, these large farms started to experiment with more ways to create crops. And people like Jethro Tull, right, created a machine in essence that allowed the planting of seeds to go. And the enclosure movement, this is big landowners buying up small farms and combining them so that they can produce more goods. And it's making these landowners rich, but the people that are working on the farms don't have that communal land anymore, and it's devastating to them. Restricted use of the village common. The village common or village green was an open area within a village or a settlement. Traditionally, this common grassland was at the center of a rural settlement, was used for grazing, with a pond for watering cattle and other stock. Restricting it meant that the poor lost what little resources they had. And freehold tenure is the legal right to own a piece of property without any limitation on its use. And slowly the poor were losing rights in places like England and even into France. The ideas in England is going to spread down into France. Remember that the agricultural revolution really starts in the United Kingdom and the Dutch areas, and then it's going to bleed into France, maybe even down into Spain eventually, and into the Holy Roman Empire at the time. But it's really this western piece of Europe where it's going to be formated. New economic elites, as we bustle through some more of these concepts. Italian merchant princes. During medieval times, those with money were the nobles. But as trade picked up during the Renaissance and Age of Exploration, bankers and merchants in Italian cities and the Dutch lowlands began to have much more money than the nobles, as much or more money than the nobles. Thus, they began to have more political power. So we start to see these general trends happening in Europe, and it's amazing what happens as these Italian merchants. This Nobles of the French has been talked about in past review sessions, so if you want to go and check that out, or you can go and Google it and you'll understand the basics of that. But honestly, it's the nobility in France kind of controlling who gets titles and nobility so that they can maintain power. And again, it's this new economic elites. It's making new nobility in France. And it's one of the ways, really, like Louis XIV kind of uses it as a way to kind of control and have more power and consolidate power as an absolute monarch. Again, this is the last bullet point here, discussing some of the concepts. The new migrant challenged urban elites. Again, it's a general trend that people are moving out of urban lands into they're moving out of rural lands into urban lands. So rural is the countryside, urban means cities. So they're moving out of the rural into the urban, and that's going to challenge. And sanitation problems, this has been discussed before, sanitation problems caused by overpopulation, with people leaving rural areas in Europe and moving into cities to look for economic opportunities. The populations of London and Paris hit the millions. Most major cities still had medieval-style open sewers, so huge engineering projects were implemented to help relieve waste and to help combat disease. What else can we say except that sanitation turns out to be one of the biggest issues in the world? Imagine if we ran out of toilet paper or something like that. People would freak out, wouldn't they? Sanitation problems are a huge deal. Employment. People move to cities for one reason, because they're looking for work. They want to make money. Rural areas, the farm, they can meet their subsistence. They can grow enough food to take care of their family. But if you want to get rich, that's where the money is, in the cities. So employment. Urban areas offer more options for work. So huge numbers of people left rural areas and moved to the cities. But most cities were not designed to accommodate so many people, so problems ensued. That's what we're talking, especially the sanitation issues. Poverty. Huge population, small area makes the price of things go up. Supply and demand. A huge population in a small area makes the price of things go up. That's why houses, apartments in cities are higher than they are in the countryside. That's why property in New York, an acre of land in New York City is worth so much more than an acre of land in Nebraska. That's why some of the most valuable property in the world is in Hong Kong, right? You go to the city of Hong Kong and you buy an acre. It might cost you like 150 million US dollars to buy 1 acre of land in Hong Kong. Whereas here in Apple Valley, California, you could buy an acre of land for $20,000, something like that, depending on house prices and values as they go up and down. So land and other things in big cities tend to cost more, leading to large number of poor in urban areas. So people leave the countryside, the rural place, go to the urban places, the cities looking for work, but that drives the prices up, and so it means that there's a problem with poverty. Crime. Big cities have more crime. In rural areas, everybody knows everybody, right? Everyone knows everyone. But huge populations in urban centers seem to provide people with the idea of anonymity, right? When you walk in a big city, you almost feel disguised because nobody knows who you are. There's just so many people. Whereas if you do something in a small town, everybody knows. Okay? You grow up in Wyoming or you grow up in Nebraska. I lived in both those places. And you do something stupid, everybody knows about it. In a big city, though, you're just a face, right? Thus, people feel like they can get away with more because they can disappear into the crowd and no one will recognize them. So that's one of the things that kind of drives crime. Plus, you're poor, you can't feed your family, and that continues to lead it. This one right here was very academic, not as many visuals, but more intellectual concepts as we try to drive through the content of topic 1.10, the commercial revolution. Thanks for joining me. Hopefully this helps you study for the AP test. We'll talk to you soon.